So our reading this morning starts with Jesus' third statement within the book of Mark that is known as the Passion. So it's 3 times now at this stage where Jesus has told the disciples that he will suffer and he will die. And as the stories move from one to another, Jesus and his followers keep moving south towards Jerusalem. As they move further south each time, Jesus shares what will happen to him. And it becomes more and more narrowly focused on the leadership core of the Jesus movement. And in the first Passion statement, back in chapter 8 that we've already covered, Jesus had spoken to both the crowds and the disciples in the north of Galilee. And then in the second one, he's further south in Galilee and speaking now only to the disciples. And then in the third, at this point that Heidi's just shared at the start of that passage, his focus narrows even further and he speaks only to the 12. In the second Passion statement, that had actually then been followed by the disciples' embarrassment of being called out for talking amongst themselves about which one was the greatest, who was the coolest, who was the best. And Jesus tells them he's going to die, and they were arguing about status. I mean, there's being tactless, and then there's that. And then the third time that we've just had now, Jesus tells those who are following him that he's going to be killed but will rise again. James and John, 2 of his disciples, they respond by trying to push for places of glory next to King Jesus. He'd already told them that anyone who wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all, back in chapter 9. But it's now as if James and John had basically just skipped that part of discipleship training school and had missed out on that bit. And the disciples' continual striving for position and status shows how little of the teaching of Jesus that they're actually taking in. They continue to expect and push for a hierarchical leadership structure. And James and John's request, where they say, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask for you." I mean, full marks for audacity there. If ever there was a prosperity gospel request, what's in it for me? I think that's probably the one. I don't think Jesus would deny that there are benefits to following his way and living out his mission. And hopefully for many of us here who follow Jesus, we experience a lot of those benefits ourselves, the life that it can bring them. That, after all, is a true way of living. However, looking out for the self first demonstrates a worldview which is in complete opposition to the way of Jesus. The way of Jesus is all about service to others, not service to self. And paradoxically, it's in losing that one actually truly wins. It's in service to others that true life is found. So Jesus responds to James and John with both patience and openness. He says, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And then when they tell him that they want to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory, Jesus responds to them by saying they don't know what they are asking. He spells it out. He says, "Are you able to drink the cup that I drink and be baptized by the baptism that I am baptized with?" So the reference to cup there looks ahead to the cup of the Last Supper we're going to be sharing in communion in a short while. And the reference to baptism looks backwards to Jesus' own baptism in the Jordan River. So baptism and cup, they form bookends, the start and the end of Jesus' mission and life. And the symbol of the cup, it's mixed in the Old Testament. In some passages in the Old Testament, cup refers to suffering. And then in others, cup is a symbol of joy. Hello. The cup of Jesus is both of these things. That is, the way of Jesus is both suffering and joy. And then with baptism, the word baptizo means immersion. So it could be understood that Jesus' baptism is about immersion into the daunting and overwhelming realities of life. And that's what he's trying to prepare James and John there for. He's saying, do you really know what you're asking here? Are you prepared to face the joy, but also the suffering and the difficulties of what this life brings? James and John say, perhaps maybe with some humour or sarcasm, maybe ironically, or perhaps honestly, we don't really know. They say, we are able. These disciples are nothing if not bold. Boldly wrong, but bold either way. Again, Jesus is patient, and he affirms that yes, they will be baptized and they will drink the cup he drinks. And to be fair, he does tell them that they don't really know what they're talking about, but then despite that, they will suffer as he does, and they will also enter into his glory. So the other 10 of the 12 disciples that are with Jesus, they react quite angrily. And we don't know why they responded that way. Were they genuinely upset because James and John were so badly misunderstanding Jesus' mission? Possibly. But perhaps more likely, given their track record, the other 10 were simply jealous that James and John were angling for positions that they themselves designed. And if this is the case, then the other disciples don't come out looking too much better than James or John. So in response to the other disciples kicking off, Jesus calls them to talk to him. They're already right there. Why is Jesus calling them? Well, it's using a specific Greek word, which I'm not even going to bother attempting to pronounce because I would mess it up terribly. But this calling of them is also the word when he first called his disciples right at the beginning. And Mark is telling us here that Jesus is making an important appeal to them. At the call of Jesus, his disciples are to follow. What are they to follow? Well, they're not to follow the way of hierarchical power, but instead the egalitarian way of Jesus. That's basically a fancy word for equality. Essentially, the non-hierarchical way of Jesus. Earlier, Jesus had said that James and John did not know what they were asking when they asked to sit at his right and his left in glory. But now he says they do know what they can see with their own eyes, that the hierarchical power that rules through domination. And Jesus says that the secular powers, the Romans back then, lord it over others and oppress them. Those seeming to rule by doing so by lording over others, they rely on status, by looking down their nose at those they deem to be lesser than them. And he says that the rulers, Rome, exercise excessive authority over people. They're tyrants, he says. But it is not so in you, says Jesus. Hierarchical, top-down power is not for the followers of Jesus. It's interesting to note here, he's speaking in the present tense. So freedom from hierarchical power is not something to which they should aspire to in the future, but something that's expected right now. As he'd spoken twice about the secular rulers, he also speaks twice about the nature of leadership in the new community. Whoever might wish to become great must be your servant. Whoever would wish to become first must be slave of all. Jesus doesn't dispute the idea of greatness, but he radically defines it from hierarchical power to servant power. Authority is fine, so long as it stems from serving others. Expressions of dominance and oppression deny everything that Jesus represents and has no place in the kingdom of God. Interestingly, the word servant in the original Greek is diakonos. deacon. That's the word that we get for deacon nowadays. To truly be a great leader, particularly in a church environment, you must be a servant. And we know too that it says that those who are great are your servants, so literally servant of you. In other words, those among you who serve the cause, further movement, live the way of Jesus, build the church, are great. The description of great is exceeded, however, by first. To be first is even higher than great. How do you get to be first? Well, by being slaves of all. Serving the church is great, but serving all is even better. Sometimes we can get so wrapped up in trying to serve the church that we can lose focus on the bigger call from Jesus there to be servants to all people. Some of you will remember Tim Haynes, who came and shared with us back on Palm Sunday, just before Easter, I think maybe March time. And he is working in Bidwell West community, so Houghton Regis, and is doing a lot of amazing pioneer community work there. And he wrote a chapter in a book called Jesus and Justice. The name of his chapter is The Tale of a Disruptive Cake. And he talks about having served over 4,000 pieces of brownies to his local community. I don't know if any of you got to experience his cake when he came along and we had to bring and share afterwards, but he is an amazing baker. And so he said he's served over 4,000 pieces of brownie to his local community, to anyone and everyone indiscriminately. And he says in his chapter in this book, he says, this gift of unexpected cake is the spirit of the disruptive biblical understanding of hospitality. It provokes me to recognize the difference between choosing to serve and choosing to be a servant. When I choose to serve, I'm still in charge. I decide to whom and when I will do it. But when I choose to be a servant, I give up the right to be in charge. I surrender the right to decide who and when I will serve. I practice hospitality, which is about equality, a subversive action of inclusion. I wonder how good we are at being servants to all, rather than just picking and choosing when and who we serve. This, after all, is what Jesus himself did when he gave his life as a ransom for many. In his death on the cross, Jesus was the slave of all. He gave his life to free all people from the slavery of the world. He was the ultimate servant, not just picking and choosing who to save, who to show love to, but to all people. Slaves are not above their master. Those who would follow Jesus are actually, that they are following him. And that means that doing so means that you need to be doing as he did, giving oneself to be slave of all. But understandably, people really struggle with this. It goes against every instinct. The process of human evolution so far has favoured the strong, the powerful, the paranoid. People who desperately have to build up as much wealth, status, and power as possible to mask their own deep insecurities. Society seems to favour these people. The system works in their favour. And these are our own default positions. But in a radical reversal, Jesus says that true life comes from denying our own evolutionary instincts and following instead the way of the true Lord. So how do we live out this call to servant leadership in our modern, often competitive world? Well, on a personal level, servant leadership involves cultivating humility. Rob shared about humility earlier, about listening deeply to others, about prioritising the needs of the vulnerable and the marginalised. It means recognising our own privileges and using our resources to influence and uplift others. In our communities and churches, it means fostering spaces where everyone is valued, where everyone is heard, where diversity is celebrated. Servant leadership calls us to advocate for justice, to challenge iniquities, and work towards a society where all people can thrive. For instance, in addressing issues like racial injustice, gender inequality, or economic disparity, we're called to take an active stance, embodying the servant leadership that Jesus exemplified. So this could look like involves supporting government policies that promote equality. It could involve engaging in community service, or simply being present for those in need. As Mark shared in his prayers, the terrible riots that are taking place around the country, the people that they are rioting against, are the ones that we need to be particularly serving. Those people who are on the margins, our friends at the hotel. I just encourage you to take a moment to pause and to reflect on how God might be calling you to express servant leadership in your context. What does it look like for you to be a servant in your own home, in your job, in your neighbourhood, in this church? What does it look like to not just pick and choose when you practice being a servant? To not just say, oh, I do it in church, so that's box ticked. But to strive to embody servanthood as a way of being. It's a massive challenge, but it's one that Jesus calls us to continually be seeking to do. And we fail, we mess up, of course we do. But the next day we can start that again. Jesus always gives us those opportunities to start afresh, to seek him, to seek his way. So just take a moment now before our next song and before we move into communion, just to reflect on where God might be calling you to serve and how God might be calling you to be a servant to all. Let's try. Loving God, we thank you for the really powerful stories of Jesus being a servant. That you came to serve and not to be served. Lord, sometimes we get so wrapped up in looking up to you, in focusing our sung worship on you, and not to be looking outwards and serving others at the same time. Lord, sometimes we can be so inward focused, where we're putting ourselves above others, where we put this church above others, where we decide who's in and who's out. But Lord, you love every single person who ever has existed, who ever will exist on this earth. You love us all equally. Every single one of us is a child of God. Lord, show us how we can be better servants. Lord, when we mess up, when we put ourselves first, gently remind us that you are servant to all and you call us to do the same. Lord, help us to serve others, particularly those who are in greatest need, not just those people who we like, not just those people who are most convenient to help, but those who need it most, those people who most need to experience your love through action. Lord, challenge us and encourage us in this cause. Amen.